Hello all of you out there, and in today's video I'm going to share with you the 10 best Ark boss tames, so let's get into it. So in at number 10 is the Wyvern, and the keen-eyed among you will know that the Wyvern isn't allowed into any bosses apart from one particular boss, which is why it is on that list, and that boss is the Manticore on Scorched Earth, and that is the only reason why the Wyvern is on the list, as that is a really great use for this creature. And if it was allowed into other bosses too, I would probably use it, and you could maybe use it for the Desert Titan, but I wouldn't really recommend that. I was just thinking of more bosses which were flying. But in terms of the Manticore, the Wyvern is a really good way to defeat that boss, as you can always attack it and there aren't periods where you can't attack it, and all of the enemies on the ground that the Manticore will spawn in, you can't be affected by anymore, as they're all on the ground and they can't really damage you when you're in the air. So especially if you've never done the Manticore before, do it with some Wyverns, you'll have a really good time. And also the Wyvern is just a great creature outside of bosses as well. But this is a boss list, so I won't talk too much about it. But if you do press C, just as a little trick, they'll gather a lot of wood, which is actually a pretty useful thing to have. And they can pick up a wealth of creatures as well, and obviously they deal a lot of damage. And if you are going for Wyverns to do bosses with, I would definitely recommend the Lightning Wyvern. They're just the best by far, they deal the most damage I think, and they have a little bit of torpor along with their damage too. Definitely a Wyvern tame which you want, and they're actually really good boss tames for the Manticore on Scorched Earth. In at number 9 is the Moser, and the reason why this is here is again just because of one boss in particular, that boss being the Moder on Gen 1, and that is obviously why these things are much lower on the list, as if you can't use them in all bosses, they're not going to be the best boss creatures out there. But for the Moder, especially if you use X-Mosers instead of the normal Mosers, that is pretty much the best creature which you can use for the Moder boss fight, and I would definitely recommend using Mosers, although the first time, this is slightly contradicting why I'm putting these things there, I used Megalodons as I didn't really like Mosers at the time, but I've come to grow to these things obviously over time, as I've used these things for the Moder for the when I redid Gen 1, because the first time I did it, I did all the way up to Alpha with Megalodons, but when I redid it, I used the Moser, and I had a significantly easier time. So if you are on Gen 1 and thinking of defeating the Moder, definitely tame up maybe about 5 or 10x Mosers, and you'll have a really great time in that boss fight. Now we have the Rock Drake, and this thing simply has to be included on the list because of its absolute cheese which you can do on Rockwell on Arboration. And yes, again, this is for one specific case as well, but it is an absolute cheese that you have to try it at some point. And actually, off the top of my head, I can't remember how you do it, but you can just look up Rockwell Arboration Rock Drake cheese and it will come up right there. And I've definitely done it in the past, and you should definitely do it if you're looking to defeat Rockwell on Arboration. Not to be confused with the Rockwell boss on Gen 2. They are very different boss fights, which should not be confused, as you cannot do the Rockwell cheese on the Gen 2 boss fight, and they work very differently. Use something like Shadowmans or Deinonychuses for that fight, or you can even use Rexes if you want, although they are a bit big getting through that teleportation terminal sort of area before the boss fights. But in terms of the Rock Drake's boss abilities, it is only really great for cheesing Rockwell on Arboration, but I think that really warrants this thing still being on the list, as that is still a significant amount of Ark's bosses. And I'm just counting the story bosses here. Yes, the custom map DLC things do count as obviously real bosses, and especially with Fjorda, there are their own dedicated bosses for that map. But most people, like myself included, really do skip a lot of those maps, and that may not be you, and that's fine if there isn't you. And actually that is slightly incorrect, because a lot of people do Ragnarok, but a lot of people, a lot of Ark players, including me, just really stick to the story maps, and Arboration is a significant percentage of it, so it is definitely a great boss creature, which if you haven't done already, and if you have Arboration and are about to do Rockwell, do the Rock Drake Arboration Rockwell cheese. Now, continuing on the list, we have the Giga, and obviously this is one of the best creatures which you can use to kill Titans on Extinction, and you definitely should if you're on Extinction and you're getting ready to kill some Titans. But actually, contrary to all of that, the Giga really is extremely rare on Extinction, which doesn't really make sense considering how widely they are used on the map. But if you have a good male and a female, you can always just breed them and just pump out loads and loads of babies, and you can essentially just have infinite Gigas. And especially for the Alpha King Titan, if you're looking to do that with Gigas, if you don't have the Mega Mech, which a lot of people will use to do that boss fight, as that is the easiest way to do it, but I know loads of people do just do it with Gigas, you're going to need a lot of Gigas, a significant amount of Gigas actually, and be prepared for a lot of them to die as well, as a lot of Gigas will die in that boss fight, which is why you're going to need probably a good 50 or 100 at a minimum. Like, that boss fight is absolutely insane. It's insane how scaled up Extinction is to every other Ark map. Even the Genesis expansions can't compete with the sheer power that comes from the Extinction bosses. So if you're looking to do Titans or any kind of boss on Extinction or any other map which allows Gigas to be used for bosses, definitely try them out and see how it goes. Now, obviously, this creature is very, very similar to the Giga. The Kronosaurus is essentially the Giga, just on a load of steroids, and it is actually the much safer option, as it does not have the rage meter, which obviously means that this creature is a much safer option, as this is going to work until it's dead, instead of just going until a certain percentage of damage is dealt, and then it will completely turn on you and your army will become useless. Although that doesn't really matter the most on Extinction, as soon as the rage meter is filled, that Giga is probably going to be dead very, very soon after. But it is still something which you want to think about, and it will still give you a little bit of an edge, as those those Kronosauruses, sorry, can work for a little bit longer. It gets a bit confusing when you're talking about two creatures, and also considering it is 8 at night when I'm recording this, and I've had a bit of a long day. But you know, still keeping up with the daily uploads as usual. But apart from my YouTube life, we should probably talk a little bit more about the Kronosaurus. Also, compared to the Giga, this thing is a lot faster and a lot more agile, which doesn't matter the most in combat, but it is very, very useful, especially if you don't have too many cryopods. Don't know why you wouldn't at the time, but still just general transport around areas, the Kronosaurus is going to be significantly more friendly than the Giga, and riding the creature around generally as well is going to be better, as it doesn't have stamina which will last for about 2 seconds. In at number 5 is the Deon, and you may be thinking to yourself, why am I putting this creature so high on the list? Surely the Giga is going to defeat any boss better than the Deon. Well, the Deon isn't meant for defeating bosses, this is meant to heal up your creatures while you are defeating the bosses, and on Extinction you can definitely use the Snowmal to do a similar job. Although the Deon is going to work passively, and as long as you can keep it alive and it has enough health to sustain the boss fight, you can very, very easily heal up all of your creatures while they're still fighting to keep the fight going and to give you that edge of the boss fight, which is really, really what you want in a boss fight. And although the Deon isn't completely essential, I would say this is an essential, although obviously you can defeat bosses without Deodons, as they aren't going to deal that damage. You have a significantly easier chance and also an easier time with that boss if you use Deodons. Don't know why I struggled to say chance there. Next up, we have the Shadowman, and this is obviously one of Ark's most recent additions to the game, but it is definitely a great boss creature, although it doesn't really have any armor. I can't remember how you get armor on a Shadowman, but there is something which you can do, although naturally they don't really have armor. And the tame method is an absolute pain as well, but once you have a breeding pair, that is simply not going to matter, and they are really, really great for Rockwell on Gen 2, and great for Rockwell on Arboration as well, although they are used a lot more widely on the Gen 2 one, as obviously these things don't spawn on Arboration. And the Shadowman is going to be a great creature for defeating any kind of boss that you can think of. These things are agile, they're quick, they have enough health, they deal loads of damage, they have enough stamina, they have loads and loads of buffs, including the pack buff, and they'll deal a lot of damage, and they even have the hydration buff. So you could potentially use these things for the Moser. These things are just so packed with abilities, and they deal so much damage, and they have a really great health stat that you can't really go wrong if you take one of these things into a boss fight. And if you haven't used them yet, tame some and do a fight with them. Now we have the Deinonychus, and you may be thinking, surely the Shadowman is a much better creature than the Deinonychus for killing bosses, and it really does depend, but the Deinonychus has a significant edge, which is why this thing is higher on the list. This thing's bleed ability translates into boss fights, and I'm pretty sure the Shadowman doesn't even have a bleed ability, but the fact that this is allowed in boss arenas and has a bleed ability is absolutely insane, and it can grapple onto large creatures and deal insane amounts of damage, and on top of that it has a pack buff as well, great health, great stamina, and great agility too, all the things which you can have for the ultimate perfect fighting creature. And again, that bleed ability is just really what you want in a creature, especially for bosses, as it will absolutely drain their health with absolute ease, and the fact that they're small means that when transporting two bosses, if you're doing a boss on the island and you have to go through the tech cave, or the bit at the end, or not the end, the start of the boss on Gen 2 where you have to kind of walk through the corridor terminal to get to the boss, these things are going to get a lot less stuck than Rexes and even Shadowmanes, as for some reason the pathfinding on these creatures are just a lot better than so many others. And I know loads of you out there use Deinonychuses for your boss fights, and if you haven't already, they spawn on Valguero, which is a free DLC, and if you have Arc, then get Valguero if you don't have it already, and use the Deinonychus the next time you do a boss fight. You will not regret it. In at number 2 is the Yuti, and again this has a similar use to the Deon, as this isn't technically essential for the boss fight, but I would say this is a must have, and it will give you a significant edge in whatever boss fight that you are doing. No matter the map, get yourself a Yuti. But what do they actually do if they're not dealing with damage? And you can definitely use Yutis to kill bosses, although that probably isn't the preferred option to use one of these things in. In terms of the actual use for the Yuti, don't know why it's taken me this long to talk about it, but they will have something called a Courage Roar, which essentially will buff your creatures. And they also have a Fear Roar as well, which is great, but it's not really relevant for bosses, as bosses exceed the size limit needed for a Courage Roar. But if someone's trying to raid your base on a Pteranodon in a PvP scenario, if you have a Yuti, just put that Fear Roar out and that player will lose control of their Pteranodon. A nice, easy, quick PvP tip if you didn't know already. But obviously that Courage Roar is going to give you that edge. But what does the Courage Roar actually do? Well, essentially what it does is it will just make your creatures deal more damage and also have a little bit of damage reduction too, which is always what you want. You're going to be packing even more damage and the enemy can't do as much damage to you. The Yuti is definitely one of the essentials. But just before we get into number 1, we have some honourable mentions which didn't quite make my list. And finally, in at number 1 is the Rex, and loads of you may be saying that creatures like the Deinonychus are more useful for defeating bosses, and I could agree with you there, but the sheer usefulness of the Rex is why it is in at number 1, and you're free to put the Deinonychus or the Shadowman or those creatures in at the number 1 spot if you feel like it. But to me, the Rex is just that creature which everyone can rely on to kill that boss easily, reliably, and also it does spawn on every map, so it is one of the most accessible Arc creatures. At least I think it spawns on every map, and especially on the island it does spawn, which the Shadowman and the Deinonychus don't. And although they both do spawn on free DLCs, the Shadowman being available on Fiorda and the Deinonychus being available on Valguero, you can't deny how accessible and how balanced and how useful the Rex is. And it is just one of those creatures which, especially on the island for the island bosses, and I would say only really for the Megapithecus, as there are some other creatures which you can use for the Dragon and the Broodmother, this is basically your best bet of creature, as Gigas aren't allowed into those boss arenas. And the Rex is just so useful for so many things boss wise and also combat wise, and the fact that they're really easy to tame tame in ASA now, and saddles are so easy to find in drops, you really have to tame a Rex at some point. And in my opinion, they just are the best Arc boss creature, as they're the most useful, they're the most balanced, they just tick every box really, unless obviously the boss is underwater, or the dragon boss, as that is particularly unfair to carnivores. But for everything else, the Rex is simply perfection, and you can never really go wrong with one. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I hope that you enjoyed this one. And down below in the comments, comment down below the 10 boss creatures which you are most favorited to, and I'll see you all later.